Hello guys, welcome back to the video. Today we are reacting to Film Theory. Should Disney buy Spider-Man for $10 billion? Disney versus Sony buy the film theorists. So, should Disney buy Spider-Man for $10 billion? Yes, because I don't know if there's any profit. But if Disney buys Spider-Man, it's gonna be good. Because they already bought Fox. And they have Disney Plus, and they bought everything that you could ever imagine. So Spider-Man is next on the list. So in 3, 2, 1, let's react.
Can we please just call this? It's obvious you're gonna win. You own all the railroads, you own all the utilities, you have hotels on every square but one.
Then we keep playing. I told you I want it all.
Ugh, fine. You know, you are a lot more fun.
I mean, Disney just bought it all, yeah. Disney just bought every single thing you could ever imagine in the movie world. So, yeah, they own everything. Most of things.
When I was a kid. Hello, Internet! Welcome to Film Theory, and our final episode not just of the year, but of the decade, provided this episode remains short enough and is able to fit in between all the editors taking vacation. You know, 2019 was a pretty fantastic year for—
I mean, it was uploaded, like 12 hours ago, so it was uploaded January the 2nd, 2020 on the US time, I'm pretty sure, because it's January the 3rd, 2020 right now. So, yeah.
for movies. We had the returns of animated classics, we had the finales to some of the most massive cinematic story arcs in history, and outside of the blockbuster space, just some really solid films overall. Parasite is great, Lighthouse is great, Marriage Story is great, Doctor Sleep is great, and all of those are from like the last 2 months. But today, with it being the end of the decade, I wanted to look back at what will undoubtedly be the biggest story of this decade in movie making. A story that will continue to shape the cinematic and, quite honestly, corporate world moving forward. Actually, it's 2 stories wrapped up together in one. The massive success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Disney's ever-expanding control over all the media that we love. Or, at least used to love. Ain't that right, Rise of Skywalker? I see you, or more accurately, I see the audience responses to you. In case you're not already aware, Disney over the last decade has just taken over everything. At the top of the decade, they had just bought Marvel. 2 years later, they would buy Star Wars. Now, fast forward to today, and they have Fox, as well as the most massively successful day one streaming service in history with Disney Plus. And that's not even with me mentioning ESPN, Hulu, ABC. If life were a chessboard, over the last 10 years, they've managed to convert most pieces to their color, or else eliminate all the other pieces from the board. But there is still one powerful piece at play here. It's a queen, and that queen is Spider-Man. Alright, so maybe it wasn't the cleanest metaphor, but still, you get the point. One of this year's biggest entertainment stories was the ongoing battle between Disney and Sony for the rights over Spider-Man. Like a child caught in a divorce, Spider-Man's existence has been a state of joint custody over the last couple years. And earlier this year, after a few awkward attempts to renegotiate their agreement, rumors started swirling that Disney might now be trying to straight up purchase Spider-Man's movie rights. The price tag is rumored to be as high as $10 billion. Billion with a B, and as low as 4 to 5.
4 to 10 billion dollars. Now, that's a lot of money, but they bought Fox for like, I'm just gonna research this. How much money did Disney buy with Fox? So Disney bought Fox for $71.3 billion. So, is it worth it for buying Spider-Man for 4 to 10 billion dollars? Yes and no. It's like at the middle. You know, yes but no.
billion. Considering Disney purchased the entirety of Marvel for $4 billion a decade ago, the question we're planning on exploring today is, should Disney make the deal? Is Spider-Man actually worth $10 billion? If not, what is he worth? But loyal theorists, it's more than that. It's not just a price tag that we're talking about here. It's also a game of cat and mouse with the highest stakes possible. It's game theory, as both sides of this argument try to outwit and outplay the other. But before we get to that part of this tangled little web, let's take a quick rundown of how Disney and Sony got to this point to begin with. It's important to keep in mind that Spider-Man's movie rights were first sold off in 1985, and they've taken a far different ownership path than Spider-Man's merchandising rights. The merch rights were secured by Disney back in 2011 for $278 million. So already, just 2 sentences into this thing, you have yourself a weird scenario. All those Spider-Man toys, PJs, and lunchboxes that you're buying, that money is already going back to restock the Disney vault. Not the vault where they keep the movies they're creating false scarcity for, no, the big one. The one full of sacks of cash, gold bars, and Walt's cryogenically frozen head. What we're focusing on today, and what all of these arguments are over, are the Spider-Man movie rights. Just the ability to make movies about Spider-Man. Now, those rights got bounced around for a decade and a half before they were eventually licensed to Columbia Pictures, the main film subsidiary of Sony, back in 1999 for, get this, $10 million. Plus
$10 million. Plus $5 revenue of films and 50% of consumer products. So Sony bought Spider-Man movie rights for $10 million. And now it's like 1,000 times that price.
Percent of any movie's gross revenues and half the revenue of consumer products. Anyway, that's beside the point. A big reason why the movie rights were bounced around so much and why they sold for so unbelievably cheap is the poor box office performance of Superman 3 in 1983. Yeah, true story. After Superman 3 flopped, Hollywood was hesitant to make feature film adaptations of comic book properties for a couple decades afterward. But Sony's 1999 acquisition of Spider-Man changed all of it. That deal brought us Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy. From the moment the first film hit theaters in 2002, it was a smash hit. The trilogy, which cost them $597 million to make, went on to collectively gross $2.5 billion worldwide, and single-handedly ushered in the superhero revolution that we find ourselves in today. The following decade, Sony rebooted the Spider-Man franchise with director Mark Webb. The Amazing Spider-Man duology starring Andrew Garfield was admittedly less financially successful than the Raimi trilogy, but one thing that cannot be argued is that it featured way better hair. But alas, hair does not matter, money does. By the time 2015 rolled around, Sony had themselves an uncool Spider-Man character, and Disney had no superhero with the name recognition of, say, a Batman or a Superman. Sure, at this point they had themselves Iron Man and Captain America and Thor, but still, no one can top Batman, Superman, and especially Spider-Man when it comes to superhero name recognition. So Sony and Disney/Marvel saw a mutually beneficial opportunity to get Spider-Man into the wildly successful MCU. They struck a deal that applied to a new generation of Spider-Man films. Basically, the deal allowed Sony to distribute and have final creative control over MCU films where Spider-Man is the main character, like Homecoming, Far From Home, and potentially Into the Spider-Verse, while Disney distributed the ones where Spider-Man isn't the main character, like Civil War, Infinity War, and Endgame. So for 4 years, it basically worked like this. Whenever Disney wanted Spider-Man to appear in an Avengers movie such as Endgame, they were allowed to do it. Disney produced and distributed the movie. That is to say, Disney paid the bill, had creative control over the movie, and then they marketed the movie. As owners of Spider-Man merchandising rights, Disney also collected themselves 100% of Spider-Man merch sales. So basically, Disney took all the risk and reaped all the rewards. In short, Sony was basically lending Spider-Man to Disney so that Disney could make Spider-Man cool again. In return, the deal also said that if Sony wanted to make their own Spider-Man movies starring Tom Holland, well, they were allowed to do it. Sony, for these movies, would pay to produce and distribute those movies, they would have final creative control, they would market it, and for their efforts, they would take home 95% of what that movie made. Meanwhile, Disney got 5% of whatever that film grossed, plus 100% of Spider-Man merch sales. So let's illustrate all these numbers with an example, shall we? Let's say that some Spider fan buys a $10 ticket to Avengers Endgame. Spider fan, but also buys a $10 Spider-Man t-shirt in the lobby because he's like, man, Spider-Man was so cool in that movie. Per the 2015 agreement, all 20 of those those dollars spent go to Disney. $0 go to Sony, even though Sony owns the rights for Spider-Man to appear in movies. This is because Spider-Man's essentially just making an appearance in a Disney-produced, Disney-distributed film. Now let's say that our
So that means that Disney got the better end of that deal. Disney got the good end of the deal, and Sony wasn't happy that they made that deal. I'm thinking that's why they had an argument, something.
Spider-Fan buys a $10 ticket to Spider-Man Homecoming and still spends $10 on a Spider-Man t-shirt. Well, Homecoming is a Sony-produced, Sony-distributed movie, which means that Disney gets itself 50 cents of that ticket sale while still getting all $10 of the t-shirt sale, meaning in total Disney got $10.50 off of Spider-Man's $20 night on the town, and Sony only takes home $9.50. Doesn't seem like that bad of a deal for Disney considering they didn't have to chip in a single dime to help finance that movie. So that deal stayed in place for years, at least until this summer when Sony's Spider-Man Far From Home became their highest grossing film of all time. That's when Sony and Disney returned to the negotiation table to see how they might arrange to share Spider-Man for years to come. Admittedly, the following info is pieced together from various anonymous sources and rumors over the past few months, but what appears to have happened is this. Despite having merch rights and a portion of Sony's ticket sales, Disney wanted more. They wanted a new deal, one that they felt more accurately represented the MCU's role in Spider-Man's massive resurgence in film. After all, when Sony tried to reboot Spider-Man on their own, they got The Amazing Spider-Man. Great hair, not so great box office performance. But after the MCU got involved, Far From Home became Sony's biggest movie ever. So, as the stories go, Sony offered to sell the movie rights to Spider-Man for $10 billion. That is a very, very high number, which seemed to be Sony's way of saying there is no multiverse in history where they'd ever sell Spider-Man. Remember, all of Marvel was bought 10 years ago for just the low cost of $4 billion. Not surprisingly, Disney declined the offer, so for a moment it looked like the Sony-Disney Spider-Man marriage might be over, meaning that Spider-Man would no longer be allowed to be a part of the MCU. But when fans found out that that was going to be the case, the backlash was massive. Disney, and especially Sony, seemed to recognize the benefit of their mutual partnership, and near the end of the summer they agreed to a new deal that allows Spider-Man to remain a part of the MCU as well as Sony films, just like he was in the previous agreement. The anonymous sources familiar with this new 2019 agreement, which is currently in effect as of this video being made, is similar to the 2015 agreement in that it lets Sony keep the film rights to Spider-Man and still lets Marvel use the character in MCU films, but the details have been tweaked a little bit. Now, Disney will help pay for 25% of those Sony distributed films, but in return they get 25% of the profits. And Disney also gets to do a Spider-Man movie of their own in 2021. In short, Disney basically agreed to take on more of the financial risk in paying for the movie, but in return gets more of the financial reward. Fair enough. But really, it's Sony who got everything they wanted out of this deal. They managed to keep the film rights to Spider-Man, they managed to keep Spider-Man as part of the MCU, and their share of the profits still match what they're paying for when it comes to producing these movies. Essentially, they managed to survive the wrath of both Marvel fans and Disney, and their characters emerged from the fray as beloved by fans as ever. Disney, however, evidently didn't get everything they wanted out of the deal, because just a few weeks after that agreement was made, more rumors started to fly. Apparently, Disney is still interested in buying those Spider-Man movie rights, but for about half of what Sony's looking for, closer to $5 billion. Which brings us to today. Admittedly, we're dealing with rumors on top of rumors on top of rumors here, but the bottom line is this deal gonna go down? Are Spider-Man's film rights really worth that huge amount of money? Let's check out the numbers, shall we? To start off with, let's look at some comparisons. Here are the price tags for a few other major Disney acquisitions in recent years. In 2012, Disney bought Lucasfilm for $4.06 billion. That gave them full rights to the Star Wars universe, to Indiana Jones, and perhaps less importantly, but I still feel like mentioning it, Howard the Duck. In 2009, as I've mentioned before, Disney bought Marvel for $4 billion. In 2006, Disney acquired Pixar for $7.4 billion. And earlier this year, Disney dropped $71.3 billion for 21st Century Fox. So obviously Disney is deep enough.
Why does it still say 20th Century Fox? Is it now 21st Century Fox? Or is it still 20th Century Fox? Because that logo is pretty iconic. Would they change it? I don't know. Is it is it now officially 21st Century Fox, or is it still 20th Century Fox? Because if it is 21st Century Fox, and there's just on 20th Century Fox because it's more iconic logo, then it's alright.
Enough pockets, drop a cool 4 to 5 billion if they want to, but would they really spend more on Spider-Man than they did to buy the entirety of Marvel? More than they spent on all of Star Wars and Howard the Duck. Remember, we are still only talking about the film rights alone for Spider-Man, whereas that $4.06 billion got Disney every revenue stream associated with Star Wars and the rest of the Lucasfilm catalog. There is no way a deal like that could ever make sense, right? Right? To get a better idea, let's play a fun little game I like to call
How much more would Disney have made?
Before we jump in, 2 quick points to emphasize just how back of the napkin the following math will be. 1, not only are the details of the ongoing Disney-Sony negotiations proprietary and therefore super secret, but 2, film industry accounting is really shady. It is, maybe that's a bad way of putting it, it is hardly straightforward. So the reported numbers aren't always a great representation of the film's financial success, but still, we'll do what we can with what we have. Let's do some math, shall we? Spider-Man Far From Home was made under the 2015 agreement. It cost $160 million to make and has so far grossed $1.132 billion. Per that 2015 agreement, Disney received 5% of the first dollar grosses, meaning they pocketed $56.6 million for just being there. Again, remember, they paid $0 to finance that film. It was totally Sony made, and Disney just gets 5% because Spider-Man exists in the MCU. Not too shabby. Now let's imagine that same movie was made under the rules of this new 2019 agreement. How much more money would Disney have made? Disney in this case would have put up a quarter of the money to finance that $160 million film, or roughly $40 million. In turn, they would have received 25% of that $1.132 billion that the film earned. So in this super fictitious scenario where Hollywood accounting is clear-cut, Disney would have received themselves $273 million. Taking away the $40 million they spent to make the thing, all told, Disney would have walked away with $233 million had the 2019 agreement been in place for Far From Home. So already you can see how the 2019 agreement is making them a lot more money. But now let's imagine if Disney went ahead and bought all the film rights for themselves, and they produced and distributed Far From Home themselves at the same cost that Sony did. The film makes $1.132 billion and Disney spends $160 million to make the movie. In this scenario, Disney walks away with a cool $972 million. So this confirms what we already suspected. If Disney can get the Spider-Man movie rights, they stand to make a huge amount of additional money. But is it $5 billion huge? Short answer, yes. Long answer, yes. In this super simplified scenario that we just constructed, the bottom line is that if Disney had the film rights to Spider-Man, Disney would stand to make $739 million more than they currently make on a Sony-financed film. If Disney were to buy Spider-Man's film rights for $5 billion, they would have to make 7 standalone Spider-Man universe films in order to recoup their investment. That might sound like a lot of movies to add into a market that's already been saturated with Spider-Man films for the past 17 years, but here's the thing. The big twist that makes this entire deal a complete no-brainer. The Spider-Man rights include more characters than just the Peter Parker Spider-Man that we all know and love. Spider-Man is a universe in and of himself, with roughly 900 related characters that would all come as a part of this deal. If Disney were in control of the entire Spider-Verse, think of how many standalone films they could make with Miles, Gwen, Venom, Mary Jane, Doc Ock, etc., etc. I mean, in practically 1 year, Sony released Far From Home, Into the Spider-Verse, and Venom. In total, 3 movies that collectively earned about $2.4 billion. $2.4 in just 3 movies, all of which are connected to Spider-Man, and all of which are only made possible because you have the Spider-Man movie rights. And if Disney secures creative control over the character, that means they're free to make Peter Parker the new leader of the Avengers, as has been rumored over and over again. This helps Disney reboot the entire Avengers franchise for a new generation with a character that is just as big of a name brand as Batman or Superman. You're not having to dip into the Eternals or Shang-Chi in order to do it. Even the most pessimistic Disney accountant would have to admit that $5 billion for Spider-Man is a pretty good deal. Because remember, Disney doesn't even need to recoup the entire $5 billion from profits off of the movies alone. As they invest more in Spider-Man as a film character, they might be able to sell the film rights someday for just as much, if not more money. Remember, Sony bought the movie rights to Spider-Man in 1999 for basically $10 million. If those rights are now worth $5 billion, that's a 500 times return on their investment in 20 years. Furthermore, Disney might believe it can get a higher return on its films than Sony was able to, and rightfully so. 6 of the top 10 highest grossing movies of all time are Disney movies. In the 21st century, nobody even comes close to matching Disney's box office success. So a $5 billion buy from Disney seems like a slam dunk for the mouse. Heck, even a $10 billion buy seems at least worth it for Disney. So then why are they not doing it? Why are they not saying yes to this deal?
Yeah,
well,
why?
why pay $10 billion for something when you might be able to get the whole thing for free? Oh yeah. Disney looks like they might be trying to get Spider-Man for $0. But if they wait too long, the whole thing might just blow up in their face. And that, my friends, is where things start to get really juicy when it comes to this deal. But we're gonna have to save that half of the story for next time, because we're already 5 pages into the script and there's already no way that this is gonna get out before the end of the year like I wanted. I'm sorry, editors! Why are so many of our editors taking so long of a break for this holiday season? I can't begrudge them. It's been a long year. Anyway, in the meantime, happy holidays. And remember, it's all just a theory. A film theory. And make sure you web shoot that subscribe button to be here when part 2 of this episode drops. I guarantee you don't want to miss what's coming up next. It is a wild story. And hey, as a bonus, we have a lot of really good film theories coming up. When all the other YouTubers are taking breaks because it's Q1 and all the ad revenue drops, we are still here delivering you weekly theories as much as we can. We got good ones coming up on Black Widow, part 2 of Hi, I'm Mary Mary, Frozen 2, I got a lot of things to say about that, and Star Wars. I've heard of what goes on in there, and hoo boy, I am so excited to talk about some of that. I feel vindicated! So a lot more superhero stuff coming up at the top.
Star Wars has made a lot of money for Disney, but has not been very good by critics and by fans. It has not been very good. I have not personally watched any Star Wars movie or anything about Star Wars or bought any Star Wars merchandise because I don't know anything about it. I just know some characters, and that's everything that I know about it because I'm not really into it. I'm not really into I'm not really into Star Wars as much as people are into Star Wars. So yeah. So yeah, guys, thanks for watching, and of course, peace, love, people, peace.